Hi, and welcome to On and Off, our podcast covering the on-premise and off-premise beverage alcohol industry. I'm Melissa Dowling, editor of Cheers.
And I'm Kyle Swartz, editor of Beverage Dynamics magazine. Today we're talking with Dr. Andrew Heritage, chief economist for the Beer Institute, a national trade association for the American brewing industry.
That, for one, that is a great name, Andrew Heritage. So welcome, Andrew, and thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's great to be here with you.
So the beer industry has had, nothing but bad news for quite a while now, with few exceptions. But some brewers did get a big boost recently with the World Cup tournament. Can you talk a little bit about, how the tournament's impact on bars and restaurants and local economies from a beer standpoint?
Yeah, so the World Cup definitely gave a boost to the category, and no doubt. I estimate based on our data at the Beer Institute, which I should say covers about 88% of industry volume and covers both the on and off premise all in one data set. So, we kind of look to different industry sources to capture different pieces, whether it's scan data or some of the other on-premise sources out there. But my data set has it all and probably some of the best coverage of any source out there in the industry. So I think we were sort of uniquely positioned to look at this impact. And as I said, there was certainly an impact in the on-premise. I estimate looking at on-premise channels where we had a bump that the World Cup drove about 2 million cases of incremental sales of what we otherwise would have seen around that time period. No surprise, the impact was largest in the places where the matches were hosted. So in state host markets, the increase there was a little over 11%. And then, you dial in and get even a little bit closer to the action, around stadiums and neighborhoods, bars and taverns there. In some cases, if you had the fortune of being near a stadium, you maybe sold 3, 4 times the amount of beer that you would have otherwise. But it was a huge boost to a lot of those local economies. And interestingly, there was a little bit of a watch party effect in non-host markets as well. We saw the bar tavern channel up close to a percentage point there. So this tells me that people were excited about these matches. It certainly was a tourism driver, people coming from all over the world to watch these games, but then also take in a little bit of uh, everything that America had to offer while they were here visiting. And beer, what's interesting in my data is that beer sort of followed them wherever they went. So in those host markets, I also have the recreation channel, entertainment venues, things that have really nothing to do with the World Cup at all, also growing. And that tells me that, this, I like to say this, the World Cup confirmed something that maybe people with some of the latest trends doubted a little bit. But if they had any doubt, the World Cup confirmed that beer and social occasions still go together. Beer and sporting events, and this was a massive sporting event, go hand in hand. And there's no doubt in my mind that that's true, seeing the data that where we saw this bump.
Yeah, hard to disagree with that. And as you were saying, one of the really fun things about this World Cup was just seeing people from other countries come in and experience American culture, integrate with American culture, and really make their mark on the local scenes. I think one of the most celebrated and infamous examples of that took place in Boston, where was it true that the Scottish fans drank Boston Dry of flagship beers like Sam Adams?
Boston definitely had quite a large jump. My data doesn't have particular brands the same way scan data does. We segment our data, and craft did have a little bit of a bump, but worth noting, most of the increase was actually in large established brands,
Hmm.
nationally distributed brands. What we segment as mainstream and import. Those were the two largest of that 2 million cases incrementally sold. I estimate 89% of it was in mainstream and
Hmm.
import, but craft had a little bit of a bump too, and certainly in Boston there was a big impact there, uh, and but it wasn't just Tartan Army certainly was a thing. There's no doubt. I see that in the data, but it wasn't the only market that really took off. And I created a little, as economists like to do. ca- Created a little index of looking at the different places of some of these channels, whether it's bar tavern or the recreation channel, as I mentioned. And interestingly, New York Metro actually came out as
Hmm.
the top market for winning the World Cup when you kind of look at all the different factors. Boston was pretty strong, came in third, but in a little bit surprising second place, I had Dallas coming in.
Oh,
They had a really strong concession channel impact. And unlike some of the other markets where the stadium where these matches were played, the soccer or football stadium, sort of located maybe farther away from other
mm,
stadiums, in Dallas, you've got the Houston or the Texas Rangers stadium right next door. So um, uh, kind of interesting that you wouldn't have expected to see as much of an impact there incrementally, given that base impact is a little bit different and having some sales already in the concession channel, but we saw just a huge jump there. And I mentioned Houston came in fifth, LA fourth. So these are some huge markets. Certainly benefited from the increase in tourism. And as I said, people went out, took in a lot of other things that those areas had to offer. And I think, and what I saw was beer followed them really kind of wherever they went.
mm.
That was something really fascinating to see in the data.
Who was in Dallas? What countries were playing in Dallas that they were drinking a lot?
I was trying to track different impacts by team to see if that Tartan Army anecdote was quite strong, and I was trying to see like what's the impact? Can we figure out a percentage that we could assign to them? And I could never really do it, so I don't know who offhand played in Dallas. Part of it is my data is weekly data, so it's not day by day. And so I was just, there's a lot of matches in one given week, so kind of difficult to parse that out. But kind of worth noting, the Tartan Army got a lot of press, and there was definitely something there, but they were not the only fans, that were driving these sales. It was something kind of very broad based, and also, I would just throw out there, when I really dial in and look at all the different markets and see the on-premise sales, closest to the stadium, closest to the action, I had a double-digit increase in every single market. So, um, you know, uh, once you were able to kind of take the data and really dial in and know and see where people actually would be, there's, undoubtedly a huge impact to beer sales there.
Yeah, and I just Googled it while you were talking, and you're right. It was an enormous amount of countries, so very difficult to dial in on just one here when it was such a wide and diverse number of people.
Well, it should be noted that I'm from the New York metro area. Kyle's originally from Boston. So
I didn't
Kyle,
make any Boston
I
jokes
win
during that.
again.
I
So
tried not
how
to fall for Melissa's trap there. I knew she gave me that question as a
every
Bostonite
time
myself, but
stumbles right in.
I did not make a Boston joke. I didn't slip into a Boston accent. I resisted all the easy jokes there. I was very proud of myself.
You did, you did. So
Well, and both areas came out faring, quite well in the grand scheme of things, I suppose, right?
And
this
Boston
is
is much
true.
smaller than New York, so we punched well above our weight, Melissa. Also, your stadium is close to the city, whereas Boston Foxborough, if anyone's ever been to a Patriots game, is in the middle of friggin' nowhere. And I mean that with love because I have relatives who live nearby, but that is in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, point taken. So how much do you think the increase was from like the fans coming from international markets versus people in the US maybe being influenced by that? But where do you think it's really coming from?
It's hard to say how much of it was driven by just pure international tourism versus Americans, both traveling to the host cities. But I would say, so it's hard to parse that out. But certainly Americans were excited about this, and one of the things that tells me that is the bar tavern channel in non-host markets, in far away from where these host cities were, had a spike over the especially in the early weeks of the tournament. So it tells me that watch party effect, while it was also strong in host markets, you probably had people coming in from all over the world, went to a match, and then went to the bar to watch some of the other matches. That was certainly a thing, but it was also a thing where uh, Americans were just excited to host this and were excited about the matches going on and wanted to watch them. And so we saw the Bar Tavern channel in some of the early weeks go up as much as 2, 3, 4%.
Mm.
Overall, it finished about up for over the full 7 weeks of the tournament, about up 1% in non-host markets, but still that's a substantial increase.
Yeah.
And played a role in some of that incremental volume that the category had.
Absolutely. Speaking of international, we wanted to ask you about what some of the beers that are doing well right now in the market. And obviously, imports have been kind of brought up as the leader in growth in recent time. Is that still the case?
So the import segment in our data is the strongest of sort of the mainstream segments. Non-alc, of course, is the fastest growing segment, but that's only I estimate about 1.3% of the category. Still growing double digits, and we can talk maybe more about non-alc in a minute if you're interested. But yes, import gaining share this year. Worth noting though that the mainstream segments, that's what the rest of the industry, for those listening, would probably be more familiar with premium and premium plus. That's what we segment as mainstream in our data. Uh, that segment holding its own right around the overall category trend. So both those two segments came out as winners in the data of selling, roughly 9 and 10 of those 2 million incremental cases. 9 and 10 of those beers were large established brands in both the import and mainstream segment. But so far this year, import doing a little bit better than it was last year. Not growing in my data, but gaining share.
Do you think that has to do with tariffs, confusion over tariffs? I know last year was a tricky year for imports, which is why do you think imports are looking better this year? And also I wanted to further ask, I assume imports are still being driven by Mexican lagers. Am I correct there?
Yes, I mean, obviously there's some other Mexican lager makes up most of the import segment. Obviously, there's some other imported brands that are doing well that others have noted out there. As far as the why, hard to say. Some of it is, I think last year there were a lot of headwinds the category faced, and maybe the import segment faced some of those a bit stronger. So cycling that's just, given that cycling, that's just a little bit easier. Hard to say what any one factor has caused it, but imports, going back 2, 3 years ago, imports in my data were growing in 2024, and so it's kind of getting back on that trajectory. I think that it was kind of already on.
So, in beverages like cocktails, wine, ready to drink, um, things have been stepping into what used to be traditionally beer drinking events like sports and concerts and things like that. Do you think the World Cup, the success there for beer is an anomaly, or do you think it might have any change as far as beer consumption at these kind of events?
I think an event like the World Cup and beer go hand in hand. We know beer and sports, especially major sporting events like the Super Bowl. Even see an impact when I look around NBA Finals, March Madness, all the things that you think the beer drinker would sort of show up at continue to have very strong pull in the beer category. And so I think the World Cup, no doubt, was a beer occasion. But as you mentioned, there's a lot of other competitive products, more so than ever before, right? Ready to drink cocktails being the one segment that as another industry consultant likes to say, sort of the black hole of RTD growth, kind of pulling from everything.
Yeah.
And I certainly see that in the data, but I also see RTDs, at least as an entire segment. In terms of volume, starting to slow the growth a little bit. If you look outside of the top few brands really pulling that segment up, you really don't see a ton of growth there. And so that tells me that that segment, like all the others, is facing some of the same headwinds that are some of the broader macroeconomic headwinds that the beer consumer is facing. Is really actually not a beer story, but kind of just a broader consumer story that's maybe disproportionately impacting beverage alcohol sales. And I would note when I look at Beer Institute data and then some of the other depletions data sources like SipSource and the team there, we have a good sort of top line data sharing arrangement, and we kind of compare numbers on a month-to-month basis. And what I see is that beer and core spirits are kind of holding their own over the past 12 months, down roughly 4%, 4.5 maybe, kind of going in that range of -3 to -4 over the past several years now. So it's not a beer only story, and even when you lump in RTDs into the spirits trend now, as I said, we start to see some slowing in the spirits volume. So that tells me there's a handful of brands there that are still really fueling that segment. But outside of that, we're starting to see that segment even showing signs of maturity overall. So that sort of that black hole that some people have sort of joked about maybe isn't going to be so much for too long.
Yeah, and you brought up such a good point. We say this a lot. It's not necessarily a marketing or consumer problem, marketing to consumer problem for a number of these brands. It really is an economic problem, especially, I know we're going to get around to talking about Gen Z eventually, but the way that Gen Z drinks, they're cautious with their money. They're tight with their money. And, it's hard to argue against that kind of strategy, considering the choppy economic waters they've experienced their entire professional careers, which began during COVID. So that was a very difficult time period. And in doing some research for this, I was trying to figure out, especially when it came to craft beer. I know craft beer is in a lot of trouble, and just the comments you see all the time, especially from younger folks. And I go to Reddit to figure out what the younger folks are talking about, and you can see them. They're saying that they don't want to spend 18, 19, $20 on a 4 pack of craft beer, and you can understand that. So I guess what I'm really trying to get at now is both economic issues and just where does craft beer or maybe the beer segment in general fit into kind of this new economy we're in now?
Yeah, so several things that I could note there, sort of a broader Gen Z trend. But let me start with craft, and then we can kind of talk about the broader
Sure.
marketplace for Gen Z, because I think there are a lot of myths where when you throw some data at it and try to look at hard spending patterns where you can gather data on that. I think the idea that just Gen Z doesn't drink or they don't like alcohol is far more myth than reality.
I agree with that.
It just doesn't hold up
Yeah.
when you try to look at how they actually spend. And there's a handful of brands where I look at strong growth trends and I think, well, that certainly is young people fueling that growth. So the idea that they don't drink alcohol is just so far more myth than reality. I do think they drink differently, which we'll get into that
Yes.
in a minute. But let me start with craft. Craft as a segment has underperformed the rest of the category for quite some time in my data, and I think some of that may be younger drinkers. I think craft when it was growing benefited from a lot of craft beer being more full flavored, having a lot of new flavors, a lot of experimentation, and as craft brewers were sort of fueling the segment growth, benefited from a lot of consumers wanting to try new things and being willing to experiment that with those different beers that maybe they didn't know about that brand, but they were interested in a particular style, or maybe they had already tried some new styles they liked from a particular brewer and wanted to try new offerings as they had them. So for quite some time, craft benefited from just continued innovation on an ongoing basis, and that segment, of course, matured. And we've seen when you look at uh, my colleagues at the Brewers Association, when you look at their data on openings to closings, we've seen closings outpace openings for several years running now. But worth noting, there's still several hundred breweries opening every year. So this idea that craft is sort of dead is that's totally wrong. It's just different. And what I really think is happening for craft is that they've been maybe a little bit harder hit by some of these macroeconomic realities that the consumers faced, both with young people and both overall consumers. But part of what's really going on there is that in a stressed environment, when I ask consumers, why are you drinking less beer? And if you are drinking less beer, are you more interested in trying something that's a dependable, known brand to you? That does seem to be, so there's some strong evidence for that in my consumer data. And that just tells me that, look, consumers are a little bit less experimental. That probably disproportionately hurts craft. But really, getting back to some of those sort of broader macroeconomic headwinds, what's really going on is that there's a squeeze on not all consumers, but on a lot of consumers. And I like to tell my team here, sometimes when you just sort of take a step back and don't get into the brand horse race or even the segment horse race or even the year over year trends and just kind of say, all right, what's going on in the marketplace over the last 5 to 10 years? We had inflation like we hadn't seen in over 45 years. Young consumers, I think, have been especially harder hit by a cost of living crisis, and we can kind of get into some of the Gen Z stats in a moment. But what if it's just that it takes several years for people to kind of feel like okay, I've readjusted to the new cost of all of these of all the things really, and the cost of just about everything went up. And beer and beverage alcohol, I think overall has sort of been maybe a little bit more harder hit than all goods. But when you kind of look at all the different data out there of what people are purchasing, beer and beverage alcohol are not the only consumer segment that have been, I think a, a little bit impacted more than others because of just a broader cost of living crunch on a lot of Americans.
And
Yeah.
you want, and
I was just gonna say there's a concert venue that opened up a couple years ago, and they have so many different beverage options, and they have a rum bar, I think. I remember getting a mojito last year, and it was $30. And I mean, even the beer is very overpriced, but the
yeah,
value proposition is real.
yeah.
It is much less expensive.
I was at a major Massachusetts brewery, and my wife didn't want to order beer. She wanted to order a mocktail, and they did. She did this at the bar, and I was watching keen-eyed to see what they did. And they literally just opened up a canned mocktail, poured it in a glass, and handed it to her, and charged her like $14 for it. And I'm not going to name that brewery because I'm a respected journalist treehouse, so I'm not going to say which one it
Oh.
was. But I mean, it is going on out there. You can understand why Gen Z doesn't want to pay $14 for a can that would cost $2 off the shelf. And you did want to come circle back to Gen Z, and I wanted to make sure we got your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so when you look at the government and the Bureau of Labor Statistics puts out a data set called the Consumer Expenditure Survey, and they track consumer expenditures on just about everything, what people are spending their money on. And they also break it down by age cohort. And so, this gives an ability, this data goes back to the 80s, gives us an ability to do a little bit of a cohort trace, right? How does Gen Z spending today compare to how millennials and Gen X spent when they were in their early 20s? And when you do that analysis and try to and adjust that for inflation, right? Because as we've already said, things cost more, but you can deflate some of the current numbers to compare, across time. When you do that analysis in today's dollars, Gen X and millennials spent roughly the same amount of money, roughly around $525 annually on beverage alcohol than they did on average than they did at the same life stage, and then it kind of increases from there. And you see other surveys already starting to kind of catch on to this, right? Gen Z coming to age a little different. Maybe they're interacting with beverage alcohol a little different, right? We know underage drinking down. That's a good trend, but worth thinking about how if they maybe they didn't have beer until they were of age. That's good. We want to promote responsibility, but it may change how they come to the category a little bit more. And so, in an environment where social trends have changed of how young people come of age, things cost a little bit more. Young people are a little bit more pinched than other generations, probably because just cost of living increases. It's a tough job market to be a young person in today, I think. It's no surprise why we might see them drink a little bit differently and maybe a little bit less overall volumetrically. But when you look at that spending data, which is self-reported, they report spending the same amount of money in those surveys that the other generations did when they were the same age. And so we should expect them to kind of follow the same path. And as they get a career and have a more established income and more disposable income, they're still going to partake in the category, and part of that is because the same thing of all the reasons that have fueled beer sales around the World Cup and all these other things is that beer and social occasions go together. Beverage alcohol, overall is an occasion-based industry. Beer especially so, and I would just throw out, beer especially does very well in that, and I think why we see so much strength around the World Cup is because beer, compared to other forms of beverage alcohol, it is truly a beverage for moderation. 84% of beer volume sold is at 5% alcohol by volume or less. And of course, I mentioned it earlier, non-alc being the fastest on an annual growth basis, continues to grow. So there's a lot of low and no options, and those are becoming more popular. So we see a continued innovation of trying to meet the consumer where they are, but this idea that young people they're actually not interested and they only want something with low alcohol and or they don't drink at all. It just doesn't. When you try to throw some data at this, it just doesn't match up, and so it's much more of a myth than reality, and doesn't even come close to explaining the recent trends for all of beverage alcohol.
You wanted to tell us a little bit more about non-alc.
Yeah, so non-alc, as I said, is a small part of the overall beer category, about 1.3%, but several years running now has been growing double digit, and that growth has been very strong. We see a lot of innovation in this space, so just about every major brand has made some sort of investment in a non-alc beer product at this point, and certainly a lot of craft brands being investing heavily in that space, and some only brewing craft beer and becoming some of the fastest growing craft brewers when you look at Brewers Association data. So certainly there's demand in this segment, and part of it is a story about moderation overall, which I think there's some truth to that. But I also think what it does is it actually grows the set of occasions that you can consume a beer. So I get this question a lot: isn't it just cannibalizing traditional beer sales when people are having a non-alc beer? And I don't think that's the case. And one of the reasons I say that is because when I look at our data and look at when non-alc beer sales peak, it's in the summer selling season, the same exact pattern that traditional beer sales have. So a lot of people talk about Sober October, which is actually not a thing at all. People just made it up, but it doesn't exist in the data. I've
Because
never
it
seen
sounds
it pop.
good.
Yeah, it's just not a thing. It's like I've tried to tease that out. It does not exist. But people continue to talk about it. But certainly dry January, we know after the holidays, people moderate their consumption, and we see sales for overall beverage alcohol. Those are some of the slowest weeks of the year. Part of that's because it's also some of the coldest weeks of the year in January and February, and beer and warm weather goes together. But interestingly, non-alc tracks traditional beer sales in that summer selling season, that same seasonal pattern very well. And so that tells me that it grows the set of occasions. And I kind of think of my own life a little bit. I have two young kids, and there's some days where maybe I'm grilling and I don't want to necessarily have alcohol, but I still want to have that beer on a nice hot summer day, and I find myself reaching for a non-alc beer. And so that tells me that it's actually an incremental volume driver for the beer category.
Well, that is a good and optimistic note to end on. Thank you so much for joining us, Andrew.
Thank you for having me. Great to speak with you.
Absolutely. Andrew, where can people go to find the Beer Institute's findings?
Yeah, so you can go to our website, beerinstitute.org, and we have if you're interested in the World Cup data or some of these other trends around non-alc, we have a series of web pages and one-pagers on our website that you can see some of the latest data, and you're always welcome to reach out to me, aheritage@beerinstitute.org, if you ever want to get my take on some of the trends I'm seeing in the marketplace.
Absolutely. Thank you again for joining us, Andrew. And thanks again to everybody out there for listening to another episode of On and Off. Please do join us next time, and we'll talk about yet another fascinating topic that spans the retail and restaurant worlds. Until then, cheers.
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 If you enjoyed the On and Off podcast, please hit the subscribe button. Also, you can find more great content at cheersonline.com and beveragedynamics.com, including recipes, product reviews, and interviews with the movers and shakers of the beverage alcohol industry. You can also sign up for our free weekly e-newsletters for both publications on our websites. Cheers!